Okay, and we are live for episode 31 of Space Rocks Uplink, and what a pleasure it is to have these guests joining us. First off, Mark, how are you doing? Are you receiving?
Oh, very good. Good to see you, Alex. Got to try to rearrange my screen. There you go. Very good. Yes. It's a Thursday evening. It's dark outside. We delve into the night sky.
Indeed, and what better guest to do that with? I mean, I guess we could probably start with a bunch of things, but why don't we begin with that background of yours? Because I think it probably speaks directly to the heart of what we're getting at tonight.
Yeah, so this is a piece of Aboriginal art done by an artist by the name of, I've got to make sure I get her name right, Alma Nungarai Granits. From the Valpiri people in Australia. And it's interesting, I was looking for something today that represented sort of traditional art about space that spans, much further back than modern culture. And what's interesting about this is actually, this is what we here call the Pleiades on this side, the Seven Sisters. And then this is actually Venus, the morning star passing by. And there's a legend about the women and the man, which is represented by Venus here. And what's interesting is that back in April, we had exactly one of these passages of Venus past the Pleiades, and many of us were out during lockdown taking photographs of this. So I sort of was struck by this. But the really important point is that, again, we have throughout our prehistory as well as our modern history, we've taken the night sky and we've used it as a reflection, as a kind of a way of placing ourselves in the universe through stories about the night sky. And that might just be through making patterns or making legends, making stories. Everybody's familiar with the kind of the Greek myths and legends of the constellations. But this is a tradition that spans the world and will have spanned peoples over hundreds of thousands of years back through ancient history.
Indeed. Well, I mean, this is the, I guess, in many ways, I could say that Space Rocks is kind of prismatic in the sense that almost, it sits almost adjacent to any area of, human culture, in a way. But I guess this is interesting because this is a rare occasion where we're looking at it over time as well, and it's like that deep and ancient relationship that I think is worth exploring for so many reasons, probably because it speaks to why it still moves us. It's not just a scientific pursuit, but it's also a cultural one as well. So we're going to be joined by two luminaries in their respective fields. Do you want to walk us through
well, the other aspect, of course, we're looking at the night sky and we're looking at astronomy, but we might actually think you probably remember that famous scene in the film The Right Stuff, where Gordo Cooper goes down to Australia and is watching one of the Mercury missions fly overhead, and he meets some of the Aboriginal people. And not only do they have representation about the stars, but they use music, and music's vitally important. I mean, I'll make the joke now and get it out of the way before the two guests come, which is that, there's often one job that's often referred to as the world's oldest profession, but perhaps it's actually music and astronomy. Maybe they are the world's oldest professions in some form. So anyway, this evening we have, it's a great pleasure to welcome on Stuart Clark, who is a trained astronomer, but is now a science journalist and science author. He's written a whole series of books, and he has worked with European Space Agency in the past on communications and outreach, but he brings that professional astronomy to what we do. And of course, from the music side, it's a huge pleasure to have on Jerry Ewing, who is the editor of Prog magazine. I think in many ways, Jerry probably wouldn't take credit for it, but I think it's been an important part of the revival of music that some of us of a certain generation love, and hopefully we're bringing new people into that. I think prog is progressive music. In the end, that's what it is. It's about progressing. It's not about being stuck in the past. And I'm really looking forward to talking to Jerry about how that fits in ancient traditions in music and also the new things that are going on.
Indeed. Well, I guess without further ado, we should bring them aboard. It won't be possible to answer every question, but I think we're going to certainly frame some really big ones and see how deep we can go. Very good. I see Stuart Clark. How are you doing? Are you receiving?
I am receiving. Good to see you guys.
Very
good evening, Stuart.
You as well.
Hi, Mark.
Yeah, great to see it. And we're just digitally birthing Jerry as well. And you should be on with us in a second.
So as Jerry joins us there, Stuart, have you since you've already seen this picture behind my head here, have you managed to figure out what it might represent?
It sort of blew my mind. I'm going to suggest that it might be particle traces from the LHC.
Well, it speaks much closer to your subject, which is that this is Aboriginal art representing the Pleiades and Venus, the Seven Sisters, and a legendary character, the Morning Star, passing by. So in honor of what your story is about this evening, I put that in. And of course, with Jerry having just joined us. Good evening, Jerry.
Good evening, guys.
Hi, Jerry.
We also talked a bit about, just as a way of starting the theme off, that, the Aboriginal people, of course, looked at the night sky and brought their own imagery to it, but also music is an important part of that through ancient and prehistory. So joining stars and music together, I'm sure people sat around the campfire and did both things at once when there was no Netflix to watch.
Indeed. And I guess that's a good starting point as any. And in fact, I know from your book, Stuart, Beneath the Night, that it's how you begin as well. So I guess a framing question that's not really easy to answer: how far back does it go in terms of the human story? This relationship with the night sky.
Yeah, this was so interesting to me because I wanted to trace this association that humans have had with the night sky. And I just ran out of sources. You get to the first written sources, and it's all there. It's clearly developed, this idea of as above, so below, and this sort of concept of how we can make meaning of the night sky. So I think it starts at the very, very beginning, from the first human ancestor, that looked up in curiosity.
Indeed. Well, I mean, this is a curious thing, because in a way, it's almost as if you're suggesting that part of what it is to be human is to look up, because that seems such an ancient question that we've had, is just wondering out there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the conclusion I came to, that this feeling that we have of standing underneath a starry night sky, this sort of this bold contemplation and this sort of awe that we feel, that is what it is to be human, and that we can empathize with every human that's lived, and done that. It's just a common experience.
So when we look, the art behind me, but there are many other ancient representations. Long before there were written words recorded, people did record the stars in art where possible. Of course, there were many forms of art probably recorded that haven't survived history. But it wasn't only about the desire to look at the stars, to engage with them maybe as a philosophical thing, or to, just wonder what was beyond them. They formed a practical purpose, of course, for ancient peoples, long again, probably before records were written.
Yes, absolutely. It's timekeeping. Time divides beautifully into the celestial objects. The sun obviously gives us day and night. The moon with its lunar phases gives us the month. And then the positions of the constellations in the night sky from season to season gives us the year. And so it's a purely practical way that people used the night sky just to keep track of timekeeping, to synchronize coming together. And what I think is fascinating is a lot of the anthropologists have sort of looked at this behavior in indigenous peoples today, the ones especially that shun modernization. And they find that the astronomers in those groups, the timekeepers, they tend to surround what they do with more and more mysticism and magic, to sort of hide how sort of simple it really is to look up. And a lot of that brings music in as well. So when you find these sacred caves which have cave art that perhaps show the constellations or things like that, you often find in there ancient musical instruments as well.
Indeed. Well, it's a great launching off point, perhaps, to shift the microphone in Jerry's direction, because Jerry, look, Prog magazine has been a huge supporter of space rocks, literally just from the very, very beginning. And and to me, the linkage has always seemed really obvious. But from your perspective, I wonder if you would agree with me that I think Prog is just as a concept for music, just such an excellent expression of how inextricably linked the sky and a fascination with the great beyond is with culture and music, because so much of progressive rock is to do literally with outer space and our fascination with it. I mean, would you agree with that statement?
I would, yeah. It's that sort of fascination with the unknown, I think. Certainly progressive rock, and various musical forms that possibly link with it. I mean, obviously, you look back at what inspired the classical composers, obviously, and there's Holst the Planets, stuff like that, and there's obviously a huge link between classical music and progressive rock. I mean, it extends a bit into sort of heavy metal as well, I think, but yeah, I would, and then there's always that joke that like space prog rock goes on forever.
I think there's the other element, of course. I mean, if, we're going to get accused of going down the prog hole, which is, and why not? But rhythm is an important aspect, of course, in music. I mean, if you think about ceremonies that would have bound people together, thinking back to, Stuart and the prehistory of looking at the night sky, music serves another purpose as well, right? It serves a kind of an ecstatic purpose, which maybe, prog may do that, but lots of other music do. So how do you view that? How do you see music sort of getting so deeply into our souls, as it were, that it's not just a consumer product, it's something much more than that, isn't it?
The emotional bond between progressive rock fans and the music they listen to is incredibly strong. I mean, you're a fan, Alex is as well. We're all fans, if you're into the music, it's a very emotive experience. But I mean, if it's something that you stall with, then you're not going to get that connect. But I've seen many people move to tears with musical performance, largely progressive stuff, and not just tears of boredom either. It's the fascination with the unknown. It's that sense of wonder that just looking up at the night sky gives you. Like wow. And I guess for me, obviously, because I love prog. It's the music gives you that same sort of sense of wowness, if you know what I mean. And it just seems to link so well together. I mean, when Alex first described to me what he was planning to do with space rocks, or it was a fledgling idea, I remember just saying to him, look, dude, I'd be completely behind you with the magazine on that, because it just works. Prog, space, it just connects,
Indeed.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Jerry, because to me, standing in and witnessing some of these great concerts gives me the same feelings of awe, that I'd get when I'm stand underneath the starry night sky.
Yeah.
And I know that's common to other people. I mean, for example, last year, Big Train were playing at the Hackney Empire, and they have this fantastic song all about the Voyager spacecraft. And at the end of that, it's really emotive. It's a beautifully written piece of work. And the place was kind of just silent and awestruck. And then one chap up in the gods, he sort of just shouted out, "That was amazing." And it truly was.
I totally agree with you, Stuart. I mean, I've seen at other Big Train concerts, I've seen audience members crying openly because they're just so blown away with what the band are doing. And obviously, I mean, it's the editor of a magazine like Prog. We connect with the fans, and I know the emotional interconnect they have with the music. For me, like sort of sitting in the Palladium, London Palladium, watching Robert Fripp with King Crimson, I'm just kind of like, wow, how is he doing that? Same sense of wow I get if I'm looking up at the stars and there's no light pollution, and I'm getting a really, I was down in Cornwall earlier in the between the two lockdowns, and obviously, the sky was just phenomenal. And it's just a very similar sort of sense of awe that you get.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the interesting thing, and I suppose, a discipline, if it could be called a discipline, and I say this, without any irony, I mean, having come from an anthropological background, because it is so cross-disciplinary. From an anthropological perspective, music, self-expression, religion, and all these things, they're very intertwined, in many ways. And I suppose, I don't want to diss polka music, right? But a lot of people look at the night sky and they don't think accordion. It's almost like you're trying to find forms of music that match the scale of what you're looking at, and maybe tap into the same feeling you have when you're seeing that expanse. And in many ways, for people, who subscribe to religions, it's also a way of kind of explaining, or making sense of the universe, I guess, in the absence of science. And that was an interesting thing, that I picked up, from the beginning chapters, Stuart, with what you were saying, was that, for a lot, it seems for a lot of anthropologists, a fascination with the night sky, didn't just give rise to, just like these sort of like these cultural elites within society, but also it might have sparked religion as well.
Yes, absolutely, because it seems as if the question that you naturally ask when you look up into a starry sky is, well, why is it all up there? What's it for? What's the meaning of it? And why am I standing here underneath all of this and witnessing it, and in some way trying to make sense of it? So I think that kind of the feelings that we get from standing out underneath the stars is what helps to drive religion. And Van Gogh, when he lost his religion just before he painted his most, his famous picture, The Starry Night, he wrote to his brother and he said that when he misses his religion and his faith, what he does instead is go out and stand under the night sky.
So let me just for the sake of devil's advocacy, let me pose perhaps a difference, though, between music and astronomy in this regard. And there's definitely a gray zone. And that is, what you were talking about, both of you, is going to live concerts. It's something we haven't been able to do, obviously, for much of this year. And it's that, to a large extent, it's a moment of bonding with the music on the stage, but it's also a community. It's also a moment where, because you're in a room full of many people on a similar wavelength, there's kind of times when it almost, to use a physics sort of analogy, it almost all gets into phase. And for a certain moment in a great gig, there's that moment where you're all there on the same wavelength. The band see it, you see it, you know it. Whereas astronomy, a little bit, again, I don't believe it's wholly true. Astronomy is a little bit more solitary in a way. Maybe it's a little bit more introspective in terms of the way, because we talk about individuals going out under the night sky and appreciating it. Whereas, of course, groups of people will do as well, star parties. So I just wonder whether there's a slight difference in the way the two emotions work there. What do you think?
Well, I think that, yes, we've talked about going to gigs as well, but I can have that same feelings of awe and the sublime if I'm, sitting in a darkened room listening to Pink Floyd or something like that. So, but I get what you're saying. There is a part of the concert experience which is about being in this big shared universe, if you like, of the music, and that astronomy and stargazing is a bit more about individual contemplation. And Jung, for example, he studied this quite a lot, the resurgence of astrology and this belief in influence of the planets in the 19th century. And he came back with the conclusion that the night sky is pretty much the perfect psychological mirror. That if you put a person out underneath the night sky and ask them to tell you what feelings, emotions, and what they think about it, you will know that person, because everyone will respond slightly differently.
Interesting.
That's interesting you say that, because I was just, while you were saying that, I was thinking about how I feel looking up at the sky, and you go through different emotions. I mean, there's a sense, the initial one is always that sense of awe, and of like, wow. But at some point, you can actually start to feel very alone and actually very small. And it kind of affects your psyche in an odd way. I mean, you don't, you can move through that, but I guarantee anyone looking up at the night sky will move through different sort of series of emotions. And that will be one of them, that like, look at that and here's just me. It's,
yes, and that
you've daunting.
It absolutely is. And you've just given the perfect example, Jerry, of what the philosopher Immanuel Kant described as the cosmic sublime. So the idea of the sublime in aesthetics is that you are awed by the beauty of something, and then also slightly, so a slight feeling of dread at how small you are in comparison comes out of that. And the fascinating thing to me is that Kant said that he said that the awe that he feels when he looks at the starry heavens is the same as when he contemplates the moral law within humans. And he said he linked them directly because they're opposite tendencies of being a human, which need to be reconciled. So when we look at the night sky, we feel utterly insignificant, as if we've got just no power whatsoever. And yet when we consider morality, we have this choice of right and wrong and deciding what that means to us, that nothing else that we know of in the universe has. The dumb matter, the animals, they do not have that. And so we are elevated to a position of supreme importance in that respect. So we have these two oppositely directed tendencies. And when we feel that, that's when we feel this strange, sublime feeling of awe, beauty, but also a kind of dread.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that before we move on, because it's not only about the night sky. There can be experiences in the daytime sky, and the one which most classically inspires fear above everything else is a total solar eclipse. The fact that they were used to strike fear into people. Of course, it was convenient that if you had pet astronomers, you could work out when they were going to happen. You could command it to happen as a king or some tribal leader. But I don't know how many of you have actually seen one. I'm sure you have, Stuart. But I mean, the first time I saw a total solar eclipse was in Hawaii, I suppose, 1991 or so. And we had to drive around to get to a place where it was clear above the clouds. And it was raining even at that altitude. So we were moving around till the last minute. We got to a little parking place. And we were there for that, obviously. Anybody who was there at that moment at 7 o'clock in the morning was there for the eclipse. But I still remember the sort of sense that I had, which was witnessing something that made no sense. Even as an astronomer, I knew what it was. I knew precisely what it was, but it struck a sense that there was a hole in the sky and the air was escaping, for example. And then I looked to one side and there was a young woman. She'd come up with a boyfriend, I guess, and they were sitting in a car, or she was, and she refused to watch it. She just faced the other way the whole time. So that even without, I never asked her what it was, but something about that moment, she did not want to see it. So I think that, it can inspire terror as well, whether it's existential terror, it's too big for me, or just an actual real, in the moment, something's coming to devour me terror.
Yes, the eclipse that I remember the most, I saw from Turkey, and I knew exactly what was going to happen. I knew it would end. There was no danger, and yet when the light just went, I did feel that really strange sensation in the pit of my stomach. Yeah. And then when the sort of the diamond ring effect came back and the sun came, it was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen.
Yeah. I'm guessing Jerry and Alex, you haven't been lucky enough, but if you haven't seen one, you do need to see one. It is probably the single most humbling experience, but extraordinary at the same time, that you can probably ever have. Aside from seeing, Robert Fripp playing the guitar properly.
I've never seen one myself, but this is interesting though, isn't it? Because I think anyone who is heard about or read about solar eclipse knows that usually they're seen as like portents of doom or some kind of thing. But it's interesting, Stuart, how at the beginning of this you mentioned the kind of the interpretation of the heavens or being seen as some kind of authority figure about it, gave rise to, like, I guess, the introduction of what you might call like a shamanic elite, in groups and all that. And isn't it amazing though how people who can interpret, what's happening in the night sky, they still maintain a level of power and fascination among people, and what I want to refer to is actually Jerry Ewing's shirt. If you, Yeah, I was like, because it's one of those things where it's not about astronomers holding an elite position, but people who are able to communicate and do that effectively are endlessly fascinating. And I think you could say Carl Sagan, Jerry, I know is close to your heart. He certainly is to mine, and I think all of ours.
Well,
why do you think that is?
well, I mean, the Sagan was the guy that kind of opened the door for me. I was, before we did this, I was kind of trying to think where my interest in the night sky sort of developed. And I remember, because my dad used to lecture in mathematics and engineering at Sydney University, and he would take me in, at weekends if he had to work on a Saturday, if he had anything to do on a Saturday or anything like that. And I remember that next door to where his department was the astronomy department. And as a kid, I'd kind of wander in. And one of his colleagues worked in there, and he was good enough to show a small observatory kind of thing and telescopes. And he sort of started showing me this stuff. And that is where my whole interest sort of began. But it was seeing Sagan on television with Cosmos that made me realize, I was older at that point, so I could kind of understand it a bit more. That it was Cosmos really that sort of like became staple viewing, because he presented it in a way that you could understand, that my dad would watch enthusiastically, and I would watch enthusiastically with him, both probably getting different things out of it, but suddenly things started to make sense that I'd only sort of stood and looked at and didn't really understand before.
Yeah, and that's a hugely important thing, obviously, because of it's incredibly specialized field of study, of course. But but Carl Sagan, he was kind of derided as a popularizer, wasn't he? I mean, at first, wasn't he kind of rejected because he did the very thing that it strikes me he should have been doing, which is sharing the knowledge out? I mean, it's such a unique I guess, and problematic position to have that was the problem.
Yeah, I think there's been a bit of a, there was, let's put it this way, a bit of a stigma attached to popularizers of the subject. I think that has just, to my mind, just completely gone away now, and that it's just so important to involve everyone, because astronomy is as much a science as a cultural endeavor. It's how we relate to the wider world and the wider universe, so it belongs to everybody.
I totally agree with Stuart there. I mean, if Sagan was still around now, or if he was if he was doing Cosmos, just imagine how big he would be as a sort of media. Because for all the affectations for ignorance that have been thrown around by populist politicians in recent years, we've also seen a huge explosion of genuine interest in more scientific matters. And you only have to look at the success of Space Rocks and the live events that you do, and the clamour from young kids up, that reflects that.
Yeah. I mean, one of the great dichotomies for me is, in fact, how it is that both things have kind of improved or got bigger at the same time, right? There's anti-intellectualism, the sense that we do have people who deny that humans ever went to the moon, that the resurgence, maybe in a stupid way, of flat earthism, but then much more serious things, climate change denial, vaccines are a way of enslaving humankind, at the same time as scientists have greatly improved public communication. And I wonder, I often, in a very sort of cynical way, I say we failed because we may have got our bubble to be more interested in what we do, but we've somehow we have not grasped that there are other movements at work which need to be reined in. I wonder if it's causal, actually, because the world is so big, full of people now telling us how insignificant we are, how big the universe is, that particles don't actually obey Newton's deterministic laws, that there's quantum mechanics. I wonder if at some level it's put people to the point where they seek simple answers rather than the more complicated, nuanced view. What do you think, Stuart? I mean, you've been in this business quite a while.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting point that you make, Mark, and it's partly, I think, to do with where we are in our understanding of the universe. So if looking at the history of our study of the cosmos has taught me anything, it is that things become more complicated before we have a sort of a revolution in thought and things become simple again. And it's in those moments of the most sort of complicated parts of the ideas where there's just so many ideas in play that it's very difficult to keep up with what's going on. And then there's a genuine breakthrough, be that, Galileo or Newton, Einstein, something like that, that changes our relationship with the wider universe and how we see it. And suddenly things for a moment in time seem simple and comprehensible and triumphant. And then, of course, science looks more and more into the details of things again, and we start our job as popularizers becomes A, more difficult, but B, more important than ever.
This is the confounding thing is we've never had greater access to information, or whatever else. But I suppose, the danger, and if we could be a little self-referential for a minute, we had, a guest on last week, Jason Isaacs, talking about the fundamental issue is people don't agree on what a fact is. Everything else falls apart. It's just one of those things, because if any information has an equal and opposing bit of information, you're never going to agree on anything. And I guess that's the weird, kind of state of affairs that we find ourselves in now, isn't it? Where almost everything is debatable. And so, the job of, science communication becomes that much more difficult.
Social media probably hasn't helped.
I'm sorry?
Social media probably hasn't helped.
No.
So, as you say at the moment, that I'm texting my daughter to say I'm live doing a live stream. Don't run in and tell me dinner's ready. So thank you.
It has its uses. So.
So, if we shifting gears for a moment, Jerry, you're not just the editor of Prog magazine, but also, an author yourself, and in Wondrous Stories, you chart the progress and development of, this incredible, genre of music that I think we're all, we could all call ourselves, pretty big fans of as well, but it's not just the music, it's also the artwork, it's the whole aesthetic of Prog. To me, has always felt futuristic and ambitious, and just almost, to be honest, I do own a few records on the basis of the artwork alone, and then I discovered the music afterward.
Yeah, it's Prog sort of, it seems it's got sort of different, it can look back in a way, and yet it can look forward in a way. I suppose if you look at the artwork, some of the more fantastic themes that arise perhaps echo a time gone by, and then you look at the more sort of abstract art approach, seems to push, into the future. And musically, someone like Vangelis, for example, Jean-Michel Jarre, those sort of guys, they're sort of forever pushing out into the further reaches of as are in different ways sort of more organic musicians in the genre. It's all this thing, I think, that it's on every level that prog seems to work, be it the visually, sonically. It's all about pushing out beyond the boundaries. Steve Hackett sort of he describes progressive rock as music without boundaries. And again, there is your perfect fit with space exploration. It's boldly going, where no one or few have gone before.
Let me pick up on that just briefly, because without naming names, probably, I don't know, a fraction of your readership actually does venerate the past much more than it venerates the future. And this is a constant discussion in the world of prog about, is prog a thing which was 1967 to 1977 and it's gone, or is progressive music, the words which were, gave rise to that short form, that's the important thing. And it's just as relevant today in the broader sense. If you keep going back to Mellotrons and saying that's what I want to listen to all the time, are you kind of missing the point in a way? Not to say people shouldn't enjoy the music they enjoy, but
no, enjoy what you like. But in the bigger the bigger picture is that, you know, there are, as you say, an element of prog fans who think it should roughly sound like Yes recorded it around 1974 and that's it, you know, and they'll tell you that it never got as good as that again, and, you know, well, that's not really prog, is it, because it doesn't fit. And that's fine, and it actually forms part of the bigger picture, of course it does, you know, and I love what Yes recorded in 1974, but progressive music as a whole is a bigger thing, and that's just a part of it. You know, that's like saying that, well, Mars is the only real planet, isn't it? You know,
well, don't bring that up with some of my colleagues because they would say that's true. But
you know, and well, you know, but I think if you go back to what the guys, the originators, were doing, I mean, you know, they were breaking free out of beat music into psychedelia, and then moving into sort of, oh wow, we can sort of push on even further here, you know. And they, you know, what they were doing was as exploratory and as far looking out for the time as you know, someone like Muse is today, you know, or Stephen Wilson, or Lonely Robot, or Big Big Train, you know, or Anathema. You just, you know, it keeps on going. Like space, prog does seem to be almost infinite in you know, because if something defies categorization, there's a lot of music that does. The chances are at some point you're going to think, well, that's a bit proggy.
Indeed. Well, yeah, I mean, this is it though. I mean, if science fiction had a musical equivalent, then I think progressive music is probably it, to my mind, because it does feel full of endless possibility, and it's not just, you know, in an abstract way. I mean, just look at any Roger Dean cover, for instance, or, you know, I think a few of us have, you know, probably own a few Rush records between us, you know, these are you're outnumbered.
Between you, yes, yeah, it's a correct statement, actually, yes.
But yeah, I mean, you know, this is the thing. It's not just the attitude of the musicians. It's the concepts explored as well. You know, just like these big, bold, you know, kind of sci-fi concepts that, you know,
yeah.
You just
totally. Actually, it's quite funny. Actually, we for the current issue of Prog, which goes on sale tomorrow, people, has a calendar with it, in which we've gone through the last 11 years of Prog magazine covers. It's the artwork we like, and we it's kind of interesting. We look back at which basically meant I had to go back through everything and look at everything we'd done. There was a couple of stinkers in there, and there's, you know, your time for Metal Hammer, I'm sure. There's a lot of stuff. You forget what you've done, and you think, wow, that was really good. But what was particularly interesting is the first 4 covers of Prog magazine all had some kind of space theme.
Amazing.
You know, even if it was just a background of stars, you know, or
I think for me, the 2 words that sort of sum up prog is ambition and authenticity. It's just not being afraid to explore ideas or emotions, but always doing it from the heart. There's no artifice, you know. That's the great power of prog, you know, when it connects with me and bigger and wider audiences. I think is that it's all authentic. It's coming from a place of real passion and enthusiasm, and I'd say that's the best scientists as well have that ambition and their you know, this sense of authenticity, that they do what they do because they can't imagine not doing it.
I agree, Stuart, and I also think that prog musicians, when faced with creating a piece of music, I would suggest probably have the same sense of wonderment and awe at where it might end as a scientist does exploring the night sky.
There is a tension here, though, isn't there? Again, sort of, you know, to break up the love fest for a second, people have to earn a living, right? I mean, of course, we know that probably in the 70s and 80s or 60s and 70s, it was a way of making money. You could, you know, all the Rolls Royces and the fur coats and so on, but music's very different now. So I want to take a higher level perspective on the music business. There's a lot of commercial music in all genres, which is, you know, streaming. People aren't buying albums anymore. They're not even necessarily listening to albums. It's an incredibly it's a much more diverse field, it seems. How do people make a living doing what they love without turning to the commercial side of it? That's something you must have seen, you must have faced with the magazine, talking to musicians.
It's very difficult because we live in a very different world to the early 70s when, the giants that we are beholden to in the prog world were creating some of their finest, most groundbreaking works. But I suspect that it's still down to adaptability, isn't it? Really, I mean, you just have to adapt to your surroundings, what is going on, and certainly, man has proved to be clearly the most adaptable creature on the planet.
Yeah. I'm just curious, just to put you on the spot though, because of course some of the older bands are still full-time musicians, but how many prog musicians who've come through in the last 10 years or so, how many are actually doing it full-time? It's probably not many, right?
With prog, probably more than other genres. I mean, it does come as a shock. I think, it was a conversation at work, obviously, because prog sits with classic rock and Metal Hammer back in the days when we actually used to go to the office. And there was a sort of, it was a real shock to some Metal Hammer readers when they realised that, that these guys, a lot of the people that they were in awe of, had jobs because there isn't that infrastructure anymore to support, making a living out of doing music. With prog, it might be slightly different. And this is because of the ubiquity we see of many of the musicians cropping up in all myriad of different projects, with one another. Look at our great friend John Mitchell. He's in Frost. He's got Keynote. He's in Arena. He's got the Lonely Robot project, and probably works. He's got his production.
It bites as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say John is typical of your modern day progressive musician. Nick Beggs. Look at the amount of projects he's involved with. Stephen Wilson, we pretty much know, is a workaholic. Constantly involved. If he's not creating music for himself, he'll be possibly working with Tim Bowness in No Man, or he's got all his remixing gigs. And that's the adaptability side of it. These guys have adapted. Sometimes you get people moaning, writing and moaning about the ubiquity of certain musicians, and that is the byproduct of doing it for a living. Means that's what you have to do. Equally, of course, there are a vast swathe, I would have thought, of younger prog musicians who have to have day jobs. But I think it's quite interesting if you look at the second wave of guys that came through, your Marillions, your IQs, Pendragons, Solstice, those guys. Quite a few of them are still full-time musicians.
Yeah.
Because they've adapted and made it work. So again, it comes down to the adaptability side of it. Do you do what's necessary, or do you go, I'm only going to do this, and therefore you've got to do other things to complement how you live.
I suppose before I hand back to Alex, just flipping the question to Stuart, the same thing must be true of an author, right? I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
As content becomes increasingly fragmented and dumbed down to tweets and social media, how do people who write books, how do you make a living, right?
Yeah, I mean, most people that are authors and write books, that's not their principal source of income. They have other jobs, and just like the musician who has band projects and other smaller projects and all that kind of thing that's going on, the writers do as well. So journalism and copywriting, or consultancy, PR, that kind of thing, all of that. And for me, I don't make my sole income through writing books. It's a huge part of what I do because it's my way of expressing myself and sort of having some doing some research and then putting it all into a digestible, hopefully, form. But I do all sorts of other writing jobs within astronomy and science to pay the bills.
And Stuart, you well, I couldn't have help but notice that the picture that was used in a Prog article, where you talk about your record collection, it seems that you own a few guitars also. So you're not just you're not just an owner of records or a fan of music.
And according to somebody that interacted, because people watching didn't realise that we featured Stuart in the My Record Collection section of the magazine. We have done Mark as well. But we socialed Stuart's record collection earlier on this afternoon as part of a push on this. Someone chipped in that you're a very good guitar player as well, Stuart.
Well, thank you. Yeah, as both Alex and Mark knows, there will be a release next year. It's on its way. It's long and it's painstaking. Yes, so. Jerry, believe me, you'll be the first to know.
Great stuff.
If he can't get you to sell it, he's not going to get on breakfast television, is he?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you this. It's interesting, the kind of convalescence of issues facing both the popularization of our understanding of various scientific disciplines, but also the fragmentation of the musical creative sphere as well, because it's like, if anybody can self-publish, if anyone can sort of record their own music and all that, it creates this incredibly crowded field, and suddenly you don't just have a few voices, you have many, almost countless ones, and it can become a bit of a cacophonous thing if too many people are having those voices. Is there a danger, Stuart, in popularization? Because one of the things that we're talking about before was just this rise of flat earthism. Just like Mark mentioned, people who deny the moon landings and all this kind of thing. Is the fact that we've created like this, discourse, public discourse that everyone can participate in, is one of the byproducts this weird position where we find ourselves in, where we've never had a greater understanding of what's out there, and yet we've never had, I think, greater debate on whether any of it's true than now in 2020, when at the tip of your fingertips, anyone with Google can access any of the information.
Yeah, and I think this is the dark side of science popularization, and what I mean by that is that a lot of people access science by reading popular articles and books, and they're written in a certain style. The technicality, the veracity of what makes science our greatest route to knowledge is stripped from the popularizations, and that's by necessity, because not everyone is into mathematics, and for some people that's a very big turn off. So they would like the conclusions presented to them in a palatable form. Nothing wrong with that. But the flip side of that is that then becomes, to some people, what science actually is: a debate about opinions and sort of textual arguments. And somehow or another, we have to become, as popularizers, we have to become increasingly good at emphasizing why science is different. And it is different from every other route to knowledge that we have, because in every other route to knowledge, there is a body of work that you absorb and you then reinterpret. And in science, that's not really the case, because once a hypothesis has been shown to be useful, transformed into theory, which can predict future events or certain outcomes, whatever that happens to be, that's in the bank. That never changes. Kepler's laws of planetary motion are as true today as they were 400 years ago when he derived them. They will never be reinterpreted, because they describe a universal phenomenon. So it's not debatable. And when a scientist says, I believe something, it's not simply because he or she has just dreamt that up. It's because they've reasoned through, and their belief is effectively the hypothesis to be tested. And as popularizers, we have to be better, not just at describing the results of science, but the methodology and the way that those conclusions have been arrived at.
Yeah. I mean, just to pick up on the point, there's plenty of these. I'm actually holding out to not write a book for as long as possible, to be the only living astronomer who's never published one, because it's going that way at the moment. But,
that is true cachet, Mark.
it's true procrastination, I think, more than anything else. But I think that it's a very important point, Stuart, and I applaud you for emphasizing that, because too often, if we look at the coronavirus crisis, if we look at how that whole story has evolved, people have wanted answers, but that's not how the science of a new virus proceeds. We don't know what it does to this group of people, that group of people. We don't know if you can be infected twice. You don't know what the long-term effects are when it's just started. So this idea that there would be a definitive solution. And of course, as Jerry pointed out earlier on, politicians have, populist politicians who are looking to deliver easy answers to people, so that people say, oh, I like the cut of that person's jib, I'll vote for them. It's the world's worst confluence of what science is and what politics is, when, tell me the answer and then politicians act upon it. And yet it's been turned around. Scientists have been accused of fudging things or faking things or being in the pay of people here and there. And I think that's because people are not taught how science works, not what the answers are, but how it proceeds. So I mean, Jerry, you talked about that before as a kind of an outsider, in the sense as a non-scientist, but somebody engaged in the political side. How have you seen that?
Well, yeah, it was Michael Gove, wasn't it, who said, I think we've had enough of experts. Yeah. It's like, and yet, of course, within 12 months, they were reliant on expert opinion. But, I mean, you can pretty much rely on it, on any politician, I think, to turn around and blame somebody else for their own misdeeds, and we'll see that happen. We've seen it already, I think, since we went into lockdown, and I think we'll see that more and more.
Yeah, what's interesting for me, though, and again, because all three of you live in the UK, because I live in the Netherlands, I in a way, it's a slightly privileged perspective. My family have, strong links to Germany, so I've been watching how it's working there. We've all been watching the US and how it's worked there. The virus is the same virus, and yet the responses are really about the politics locally. I mean, we look at New Zealand and they've had a totally different response. You look at Southeast Asia, some countries I think it's Taiwan has had no cases in 200 days, right? They live fully open lives. Okay, it's an island with a boundary around it. So I think it's that issue, isn't it? Politicians in different places are refracting through the lens.
It has been interesting to see that the politicians who seem to be of a similar ilk, the countries that they represent have been hit the hardest. Yeah, that seems quite interesting to somebody who comes from a non-scientific background.
Yeah, and yet I've had debates with scientists. I'm sure you have, Stuart.
There must be some sort of sympathetic approach that they all have, or have utilised to the virus, that has caused that.
Yeah. But I've certainly seen, which has been very fascinating to me, is some of my science colleagues in the UK, not all by any means, but a number of them sort of siding with the conspiracy theories that the numbers are being blown out of order and that this is all government falsely manipulating the science in order to control people. And it becomes politicized. Of course, scientists are never free of politics. We live in culture, we live in community, we're influenced by politics. But that movement I've seen in the UK has almost disturbed me.
I think it comes down to this idea of controlling the narrative. And when you're dealing with science, a virus, the virus doesn't care about the narrative. The virus just follows, the laws of physics and does what it does. And that's the big mismatch. Politics, public life, I think, is so much today about trying to control a narrative. And this goes back to Alex's point, where facts don't seem to matter very much, so long as you control the narrative. And the ends justify the means. So however you do that, if you are then eventually found out to be factually inaccurate later on, emotionally, in a lot of people, your narrative has taken hold. And yet here we have a situation where you can't control the narrative of this virus, it's just going to do what nature
You,
intends it to
you're still seeing them try to control the narrative. You know, you said, Mark, looking in from the country, I can assure you that if you lived here, it doesn't take too much of a stretch of the imagination to believe that the government are telling you a pack of lies just to get over whatever point of view they want.
Yeah, and the Netherlands isn't perfect either. It just has a different perspective on it, right? Germany's had a different perspective for all that you might think. They've handled it better. They've had anti-vax people and people not wearing masks running around by the Brandenburg Gate as well, right? Nowhere's immune from it, I suppose. And it builds on other things, right? I mean, in the UK, I don't think it's deniable that the response to the virus is built on a background of Brexit in the sense of the way that the body politic is, and the way that the fraction, the polarization of the public has become a more important issue in the last 4 years. It falls on fertile ground to then have fights about how to manage the virus. It's the usual people banging heads about it, because they bang heads about everything these days.
And but fully agree. And I mean, to bring it back to our starting point in some sense, I mean, science and indeed astronomy have a very long history of presenting politically inconvenient views, right? I mean, this is the thing about it all, right? These days we kind of accept, well, most people seem to accept that the Earth is not the center of the universe, but there was a point where that was a controversial idea, and it, resulted in, all kinds of, horrific acts and so on. And I suppose that's a thing that through time and through history, astronomy and an understanding of our place in the universe has not existed in confluence with religion, but almost in direct opposition to it. Certainly, in kind of like Judeo-Christian belief systems, where it's humankind is an expression of an all-powerful God that have to be in a central point in the universe. And I guess astronomy tells us the complete opposite. Not that we're insignificant, but that we are really small, and in fact, so small that you need equations, I suppose, to even begin to explain just how tiny we are. Again, not insignificant,
Absolutely,
but really tiny.
Yeah, and in the wake of the scientific revolution, the work of Newton, society did go through a sort of a crisis of sorts, in that before that time, the wider universe was explained in a way that seemed that was widely known about and felt very understandable, that it was some sort of heavenly realm, and it was a realm that was completely different from the Earth, and it was made of perfect matter called the quintessence, and that the stars were not other suns, but they were holes in a boundary called the firmament, and these holes allowed the pure white light of heaven to shine through, and we saw that. And after the scientific revolution, it said, no, that's not what it's all about at all those stars, they're distant suns, they're probably planets, it could go on forever. And the German philosopher Max Weber, he said that the scientific revolution, didn't spark the Enlightenment, he said, it began the disenchantment, the time when we didn't look up and wonder and all the rest of it. Well, the natural philosophers of the time didn't do the best job in the world of trying to explain this new worldview to the science popularization was pretty poor in the 18th century, and it's the philosophers and the poets that tried this, and the nocturnes written in the 18th century, some of them are absolutely beautiful. And what's really fascinating is that often they talk about the wider solar system and planets, stars and suns, and then they all get a bit hand wavy because it starts to get a bit big, and they sort of say, but we don't need to worry about that because God takes care of that. Others say, we don't actually need to worry about that because we can encapsulate the vastness of it all in mathematics. And so this is the concept, Kant's concept of the mathematical sublime, that these things that are too big for us to hold in our brains, science gives us the route to the answers because we can encapsulate it mathematically. And so mathematics is a kind of a wonderment that replaces God and the Almighty in these new views of the cosmos.
So I'm wondering, just to bring you back to music in that sense, Jerry, you talked earlier on, classical musicians of that time, Stuart talked about the nocturnes, but if you think about the massive scale of the music of the end of the 19th century, of Mahler, of Wagner, in some way, there's that sense. I mean, certainly in Mahler, I'm a big fan of Mahler. There's that true sense about the space as a bigger thing. He doesn't say of course he did believe in God, but he was troubled by his belief. And I wonder, whether that, thinking back to the 1960s in a way, I wonder whether prog and other forms of exploratory music came out of a world which was changing very, very rapidly, right? From beginning of the 60s through to the end of the 60s, you went from guys in, skinny ties and nice haircuts to hippies who had been off to India, and, same group, right?
A phenomenally quick changeover. I mean, at the beginning of the 60s, the pop charts were dominated by crooners who you could take home to meet your mum. But within 4 years, you had these scruffy Herberts playing beat music and growing their hair. Within 2 and 3 years of that, their hair was longer, and what on earth was this sort of weird music they were making? It didn't even sound like pop music. It was, psychedelia, got through, and then of course the doors were open. It was like, well, we can do whatever we want. In rock music, it seemed to split, and you either went off on a very heavy route or you went off on a more progressive route. Yeah, I mean, and that's just in the space of 10 years.
But that matches the uncertainty in society, yes, at that point, right? The breakdown of traditional structures in some sense.
Totally. But I suspect that the rock musicians were probably taking more drugs.
That's why music's so boring these days, right? No.
Well, I mean, no. I mean, I was asked. I got asked in an interview what it was that brought prog to the fore, and I was like, well, it was drugs. Yeah. The beat guys started to take drugs. The drugs changed. They got, once hallucinogenics got involved, boom, off you go. And that's the huge thing. That's why it happened so quickly, I think. From suited crooners you could take home to meet your mother to blokes that your parents would be absolutely petrified of in a decade.
Yeah. It is remarkable. I mean, like, take, okay, not a prog album, per se, but no question, progressive. Like, take Space Ritual by Hawkwind, for instance.
Yep.
And you consider what happened just 10 years before. It's astonishing. But again, it is not just the approach to the music, but it's also the presence of Michael Moorcock, for instance, and sort of music suddenly occupying a border territory with science fiction and really big ideas. I mean, you listen to stuff like Space is Deep, for instance. It's just it's so interesting how the history of prog music, to me, in many ways, seems inextricable from this explosion of ideas about things as well, and just, I guess, what was just described as, this breakdown of barriers, and
I think that that whole idea of how things move so quickly is never more apparent than in the first wave of prog bands. You listen to a lot of their first records, and then you listen to their second records, and the drastic difference, sonic difference, and the difference in songwriting and ideas, just everything. It's almost like two completely different bands as they sort of set forth on the path that people much more know them in a more popular vein.
Indeed.
I also wonder as well if the that really strong association between prog and the wider universe is because of this, in the 20th century, technology is just extraordinarily advancing. You've had also scientifically huge advances, general relativity, quantum mechanics, ways to look at the universe completely differently. As a result of some of that, you've got space travel for the first time. Actually, for the first time in human history, we're now touching the night sky. We're not just standing underneath it. And then you've got the work of all the nuclear, reactors and power. And so here you're bringing the power of the stars down to Earth and controlling it. It's just an extraordinary sort of interaction of humans and a natural world that seemed forever for the previous human history to be untouchable. And you've got all the technology in electronic instruments and things like that. So it just seems like the perfect, to me, thing to explore with all of those new instruments and techniques is a new sort of interaction with the wider universe.
Yeah, so
it also comes at a moment when, of course, part of the space race is about superpowers, and it's about political uncertainty in the world as well, right? So I'm not saying that music was escapism. It was also about creating a counterculture, right? And both the music and the sort of new vision of the universe which was arising, we forget how many things we take for granted now weren't even known in the 1960s. How rapidly things changed there. Sorry, Jerry, I cut you off.
That's fine. You only actually have to interview any of these musicians who actually, were of an age to be aware of the space race and the first people, and the landings, the moon landings, and anything of this, to just, to glean just what a massive impact that actually had on them, and their lives as a whole. Obviously, I'm too young to remember any of that, but yeah, every musician I've ever interviewed, if you start talking about space and things like that, they will go back to the where they were when they're watching Armstrong on the moon, and they all remember this stuff, and it had as much of an impact on their music as it did on the wider world at the time.
Well, and this is a perfect launching off point to bring some of the people in, who've been watching tonight, because some great comments, and we can't have this meeting of minds without talking about some specific albums and recommendations and so on. So Joe's actually written in, Joe Kendall, I think we all might be familiar, and she's
this will be a trick question. It's a trap.
Well, in the panel's opinion, what music best helps to transport us through time and space? She mentions Brian Eno's Apollo atmospheres and soundtracks, which I have to completely agree. I think it's got to be up there, So just going around, what piece of music or album would you say best takes you through the cosmos?
Giving the other two a moment there, I was lucky enough, and of course Apollo's the album was played, but there was one group in the UK that actually plays it live, a band called Icebreaker, a contemporary ensemble, and I heard them play that in, of all places, I've got to be very careful I get it right, in Lithuania last year. They played that, and then they played a piece of music that we were working on with a contemporary composer called Kate Moore, who's in Amsterdam. And they fit together perfectly in that environment. It was in a contemporary music festival. So it's a brilliant piece of music inspired from that time and rarely heard live, but and it is something to listen to in a room full of people, because it's a long piece of music as well, right? It's not exactly a 5-minute pop song.
Yeah, but combined with the imagery, because
which they play in the background while they're actually performing.
Yeah, indeed. Fair enough.
Anyway,
so
Jerry,
it's a big question. So to put,
you look. Eno's Apollo is fantastic, and obviously Space Ritual by Hawkwind, but I think for me it's got to be Vangelis. Anything that he put out in the 70s is something I can lose myself in and feel that I'm being transported beyond where I am. It's just something about what he does. It's so otherworldly, I think, in a way that it's just easy to lose yourself in the depth of his music. And then when you try and think about what was inspiring him, you go off on a completely different journey as well, whilst listening to the music. So I'd go with something from the 70s, Vangelis.
Indeed. And I suppose you could say, talking again, throwing back to what we talked about before, how people evolve. You listen to like Aphrodite's Child, for instance, and then you go into what he was doing in the 70s and beyond. It's amazing, the state.
Yeah. Well, if you listen to the first two Aphrodite's Child albums and then you listen to 666, it's like listening to a completely different band.
Indeed.
And of course, it's Heaven and Hell, which is his album from 1975, which becomes the theme music for Cosmos 5 years later, right?
Yeah. I mean, there was a couple of albums that he did all around that time, that have that whole feel.
Yeah, Albedo 0.39, of course.
That's one.
Yeah, we had a funny discussion about that because of albedo 0.39. Stuart knows this is the reflectivity of the Earth. Yeah. It reflects 39% of the light that falls on it.
I too know that, but only because I had to look it up when I was reviewing a reissue of the album just to make certain.
so when we worked with him a few years ago, he wrote an album inspired by ESA's Rosetta mission to the comet. He sent us music, and I shouldn't say this, but I've got alternate versions of the album kicking around on my hard drive here, songs that didn't make it onto the final thing. So, which is nice to have.
That Rosetta album that Vangelis did, actually, for me was, I mean, I like his stuff in general and across the board, but that really sort of took me back to those 70s records.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, he didn't have titles for all of the songs. So he asked one of my colleagues, Carl Walker, to name some of the songs. So I picked Albedo 0.06, which is the reflectivity of the comet as we knew it at the time. So a bit of an in-joke, but I mean, he's hugely inspired by astronomy and is very keen to work on projects. We've done several things with him. It's brilliant. I mean, from a fan, myself from the late 70s, to actually go and sit in his room in Paris while he plays music and composes in real time. Oh, it's amazing.
So Stuart, no pressure at all. Vangelis, over to you.
Yeah, it's side 3 of Exit Stage Left by Rush, and on that side, they play the acoustic guitar instrumental Brunsbane, go into this sort of strange, otherworldly, the trees, and then the everything just gets so spacey, and Alex Lifeson does this extraordinary volume pedal work on this guitar, and Neil Pierre does just amazing percussion. Geddes making all the strange spacey sounds on the synth, and it is utterly transcendental. I mean, it still gets me, today. I'm not on this earth when I am listening to that. I never knew music could be that good. I first heard it, in whatever it was, 1980, 81, and that was it. That whole side of that album is like floating through the universe, having this sort of altered perspective on everything. I mean, if I'm ever on a spacecraft plunging through a fiery death, in an uncontrolled re-entry, that's the last thing I want to hear.
Fantastic answer. And a question that follows that up really beautifully, I think, is not just the music, but Chris asks, how influential was, I guess just as or Vangelis, the Rush, architects of this genre, how influential was the artwork of people like Chris Foss and indeed Roger Dean, who came up before?
Well, Chris Foss, for me, I mean, immediately those are the science fiction book covers, many of the Asimov books, I think, in that period. I mean, I must admit, we've had this discussion before, I think, on Uplink. I'm not a huge fan of Asimov anymore. I mean, I know that's not traditional. It was for when I was 16, it made sense. I've certainly moved on a long way, but the Chris Foss covers, that superbly angular, multicolored, they weren't just gray, boring spacecraft, as if they were chameleons, but the machinery, but in chameleon colors. Of course, the Roger Dean stuff on the Yes albums and other bands. I'm gonna get it wrong if I say the wrong bands, but by Uriah Heep, I think he did a number of covers for other bands. Yeah, that's a very much more organic thing, of course. That's almost, is there really space in Dean's covers? Sort of. I mean, the idea of a planet falling apart on a fragile cover and going out into space, but it really is a much more inner space thing. He's much more nature inspired, I think, Roger Dean, whereas Foss is resolutely machines in space, hardware stuff.
Yeah, my early sort of conception of what science fiction was sort of nucleated around Chris Foss's illustrations on the front cover of books. I was always drawn very much to that sort of technicality and seeing spacecraft and things like that. So yeah, great artist.
Indeed, no question.
Yeah, the Chris Foss stuff. I mean, if you think of something like Joe Joe Meek's I Hear a New World, which is actually a really early sort of electronic sort of prog sort of space concept album. That kind of evokes that kind of imagery for me. I've always thought that Dean intimated different solar systems and planets.
Yeah.
In what he did, an alternative to what we were used to. I also look at some of the work that Hypnosis did. Really, not all of it because it doesn't all work, but that I think that there was a certain modernism to what they did that hinted at a new space age in some of their sort of more abstract pieces. Barney Bubbles, some of his Hawkwind stuff is completely out there as well.
There was also Rodney Matthews did a whole bunch of things around that time, but they tended to be a bit more on the kind of the fantasy side. Exactly.
That's different worlds, not different solar systems. So,
Yeah.
It's again, this segues beautifully into another question from someone who's watching. Jeff asks, has the movement of music away from LPs been detrimental to the link between space and sci-fi and rock? And I guess what he's really talking about is like big epic records. Has that been a problem, Jerry?
Yes and no. I mean, for the people that we cater for, they still like the album, as Stephen Wilson calls it, using the album to take people on a journey. So that's not going to go. I think, in the future, we've got serious issues in terms of people's attention spans and what they're prepared. We're already seeing established musical artists starting to release bits of music, but not whole albums, because, that is the way that streaming and things have led music. We're sort of seeing the early move away, I think. When I first started, I launched Classic Rock, and then I've moved over to work on Maxim magazine on their website. And I used to get asked all the time. This was at the tail end of the 90s. So I used to get asked all the time, is this the end of print? Which is still an argument, but print is still there. Yes, sales are slowly decreasing, but it's still there as a medium. In our lifetime, we probably won't see it, but eventually, people will view, it will be a discovery like the beginning of 2001. Someone will find a record and they'll all be like, wow, what is this? Someone will smash it and a bit will float up into the it's inevitable that to a certain extent that it's things are going to go that way, because that's the way. There's not much you can do if society shifts that way. You can't pull it back. And this goes back to my thing about adaptability.
Yeah.
Whoever is going to thrive in that environment will adapt to survive within it.
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily mean the music needs to change.
No.
But just
Well, one of the topics that comes up frequently in Uplink is talking about film soundtracks as well. And you've got musicians who are composing sort of extended ambient pieces within the context of a film. People like Johan Johansson and, Alex and I, we've both been watching the TV series Dark recently, and the music there of Ben Frost, extraordinary creation of atmospheres. Maybe it's not a song that you can sing along to necessarily, but it seems to me that there's that extended form of music in a different environment. That said, right, many films are becoming incredibly short attention span, pixels flying everywhere, and maybe sort of finding a place where extended reflective pieces, musicians, we work with some good friend of ours, Charlotte Hatherley, right, has gone from writing 3-minute pop songs to writing film soundtracks, and
very good ones as well.
Some room there.
Indeed.
Someone that was in Ash is now makes music that people that buy Prog magazine actually listen to and go, this is really interesting.
There you go.
Not being detrimental to Ash in any way.
Not at all. No, they love space as well. We're happy. We're going to bring them on Uplink soon enough, I hope. So.
Indeed. Well, it's been a very long journey. Just this sort of process of discovery that humans have been on. I mean, I think, Stuart, your book begins with humans from what 300,000 years ago, our ancestors, perhaps, identifiably began doing things that might have related to the night sky. And I think that we'll be continuing to do so in myriad ways for a long time to come. But for tonight, though, I think that we've explored a lot of ideas, and it's been absolutely brilliant to have both Jerry and Stuart on. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for continuing to support Space Rocks. It's been really great.
Thank you. Absolute pleasure. Absolute pleasure.
Thank you,
Absolute
gentlemen.
pleasure. Yeah, thank you.
We'll see you in another sphere soon enough, hopefully. So, and maybe in the flesh again soon enough as well.
Stuart, last night I read your chapter, "The Music of the Spheres," listening to my Goldfields, "The Music of the Spheres."
That makes me so happy, Jerry.
Fantastic. Well, look, before you guys go, we've I think we can all throw the horns adeptly, but Mark, over to you.
Yeah, our tradition, as you've seen, no doubt, is the space, Vulcan salute, and the rocks, horns. So if you would do that for us, please. Jerry's looking at how do I get me? There you go. Perfectly done. That's almost, and even Alex has got his thumb out for once. Perfectly well done. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
It's only taken him 30 episodes to get it. But,
always
Alex,
get it.
I'm shocked.
I know. I'm going to relinquish my membership card, guys. It's nice to have you along. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you very much. Talk to you soon.
Thanks so much.
Very good. Okay. Well, Mark, where to even begin? And to be honest, I could have just talked about albums all night, but it's one of those,
it always happens, right? How does the clock move at accelerating speed during Uplink? I've never understood it, but
it was a prog heavy evening, and in no small way down to I guess friends and longtime supporters of Space Rocks.
Yeah.
The time went that quickly, so we'll have to have them back.
Absolutely. So shall we didn't, in the usual completely chaotic way of Uplink, is this the moment to say who we have for guests next week, just to give a bit of a heads up?
I think that we should.
Okay, so going in a completely different direction in a sense, but the touchstone, as for many things, the origin of Space Rocks, it's only traditional. Back in 2014 and through to 2016, we're involved with the Rosetta mission, but making some documentaries. So programs for TV, and there were some made in France and in Germany. There were some made for PBS in the US, for the BBC and others. But a couple of people that I've kept in touch with since, working in Canada and working for the Discovery Channel. They made a couple of fantastic documentaries about Rosetta and also live programs during the event. And so I've asked them to come on to talk to us about how does pretty much the topic we've talked about this evening a little bit, how do you take complicated ideas and make them into stories that people will watch on a television and come away with more than entertainment? How do you educate? How do you make science TV and science documentary? So the two people are Shelley Ayres, who is the producer of that Rosetta documentary back in 2014 and the other version 16. And she's a director, a producer, a writer, and her friend who is the presenter of those documentaries, Dan Riskin. And Dan is actually a biologist. He studies bats for a living. Go and follow his stream on Twitter and his timeline. You'll see bats everywhere. And he was the host of a TV program in Canada at that time. So as a scientist who became a science communicator, I'm really interested to hear from both of them what their experience has been in bringing science over into the broader general public. And these questions we discussed tonight, how do you do that without dumbing it down? How do you maintain the process as much as the result?
Indeed, as one of the other potential titles for tonight was just around the campfire, right? And I guess
exactly.
A human habit as old as humans themselves. So again, thanks everyone for tuning in and for supporting what we do. Do subscribe to our newsletter at spacerocksofficial.com. And Mark, we look forward to seeing you very soon indeed.